Thank you, Ashley, and hello, everybody, for wherever you are at in the world. I'm pretty excited to be here and continue the conversation that we started. If you joined us several months ago on the first webinar that we did, this is a I am just sort of fascinated by what's going on around generative AI and also excited to be able to kind of share with you our perspective, the things that we are seeing, the use cases more broadly, and it is incredibly fast moving. And so I just wanted to sort of have us all take a little bit of a breath here before we get going, that you are sort of not alone. And hopefully, as you sort of see, here are a couple of themes that we are just seeing across no matter which industry, no matter which sort of clients we are talking about. There's sort of four things that are at the moment kind of bubbling to the top. One of those is just the pace of the technology advancement. Some of those coming from OpenAI itself, some of those coming from Microsoft. Those are also coming from Google, Amazon, vendors like Salesforce. So there's just this tremendous pace of sort of venture capital investment that is continuing to happen and sort of fuel innovation. Across the board, we are seeing learning and experimentation. So how do I understand what this is? Where is it going? What's the impact potentially going to be for my organization? And then, because if you just look at ChatGPT in and of itself and how sort of relatively easy it is to use, well, we have a lot of people that are beginning to utilize it, put it into practice, figure out what this kind of means from an impact perspective. At that same time, we have this balance around, well, there's potentially some risks and considerations that we need to have. So we had a lot of our clients, at least initially, begin to close off access to their employees around specifically sort of OpenAI. And some of those have eased since then, but that sort of teases out into, well, we've been doing a lot of learning and experimentation, but now we're really starting to think about what does this mean from a policy, a security, and a governance perspective. So again, these may be conversations or topics that you all are beginning to kind of think about. I just want to share with you that you're not alone as a part of this. And really, beyond just the pieces of the technology that are there that are enabling what can happen from generative AI, if we take a step back and look at the broadening of not just Gen AI, but artificial intelligence in general, this is the beginning of a wave that is actually going to change how work is going to be done. There is going to be an ever presence of these co-pilots. You can think about that as assistants in different software applications that you will be utilizing that are going to help you tap into this very different type of knowledge. With generative AI, there's the ability to actually not just look and analyze, but to be able to actually create new things. And so how does that actually change the creative process? And creative process can do anything from the coding side to actually, I have a new idea. I have a conversation I want to have with a donor. We have a new event that we want to run. Those are all different types of things that we, as humans have all kind of gone through. But how do we think about the beginning of how the technology begins to affect the change of how we begin to generate sort of new ideas? I talked a little bit about the software engineering. There's operational sides of this around the automation layer that is coming. And then a very big and important part of this is the governance and security angle. And so in our last session, we talked a bit on exactly what generative AI is. I want to get you sort of in this mindset of, we believe that AI is going to be pervasive. And when it's pervasive, that means that AI is going to be in everything that we are doing. So if you think about just anything where there's a text box today, that will eventually be fed through some large language model like OpenAI has. To give you a contrast or a different perspective on that, think about what we do with spell check today. So any application that you're in today, when you see those squiggly little red lines underneath a word that potentially you have incorrectly spelled, or it doesn't recognize what it is, that's not how spell check worked 10, 15 years ago, right? You actually had to go click a button and said, run spell check on this, and then it gave you the results. And if you go back before that, spell check was even different from that perspective. So right now we have sort of almost this real-time recognition that is happening of, have I spelled this word correctly? That is where we're going to get to from an AI perspective. And the things that we are doing, it is going to be baked in, it is going to be assisting us in various ways. And it's in some instances going to be invisible in ways that we just don't even think about today from that spell check. Now, if you believe in that pervasiveness that is going to happen, there are lots of implications then to sort of think about as a part to it. And AI in and of itself is just a little bit of a different beast in terms of traditional application development and the different systems and the tools that we all use. So I like to think of AI as it's this living system. And it's a living system because you cannot just sort of do one thing with it and then you're done. There is a care and feeding that needs to happen. You have to continually go back, update the data you have, the training that you need to be able to do as a part of it. And so there's a different team that you need to use to basically look at how you're building and utilizing different AI models. There's a different support mechanism that is there. There's a different operational component, and there's a different creative component that comes to it as well. We like to look across 5 different domains that really center on this notion of trust. Because when you think about anything that we're doing from an artificial intelligence, and that can be sort of analytical AI, or it can be all the new things around generative AI, trust sits at the center of that, because we are talking about things that we are doing that our brain traditionally has done, and that now we are enabling the computer to be able to do those. So you've got to think about risks and mitigations. You've got to think about how the skilling, the processes, the work is actually going to be changing in some respects for people within your organization. You've got to think about the security, the compliance, and the infrastructure that goes into supporting this. You've got to think about the corporate values and the societal impact, and even part of the sustainability of what you're doing when you're utilizing the technology. And even more, all of those are important. I think where we are all at today is there's just this notion of AI fluency. And I'm specifically using fluency versus training, because training is something where you go and you do it and you walk away and then you potentially look to apply it. This space, again, is moving so quickly. How do you keep fluent in what is going on, the potential impacts and changes? That is not just about learning, but it's also about discussing and challenging, and really feeding into that notion that this is something that is a living system. So I want to sort of open up a bit and share with you our Avanade journey and what we've been on for the past 8 months or so. Because I think hopefully you will see this as a way of a path forward potentially for your organization. You've already started to do very similar types of things. So one of my sort of roles at Avanade, in addition to the things I've been helping us with on generative AI, is around emerging technology. And so with our partnership with Microsoft, we were actually very early in our engagement. So back in 2018 is when Microsoft started their early partnership with OpenAI. The very first services that then came through on the as part of the Microsoft Azure services was in 2021, and we were part of those early previews. So we started looking and playing and understanding and experimenting with that technology. And then there was the ChatGPT moment that happened here in November of last year. And then as we looked at that as an organization, we looked at it from a security risk, compliance, what are we going to do, and the effect kind of from our people, how we're going to give them guidance, and then also what the tech was going to enable. And so we stood up a task force across our entire business that had representatives from almost every single part of the organization to, one, begin to think about what the impacts were going to be able to actually answer questions and serve that appropriately to our clients, be able to figure out what we needed to do internally as well, and really open up those lines of communications. we've evolved the notion of our task force since then, but we still have that basic structure in place. And as a part of that, we've then updated and looked at our policies. We've actually issued employee guidance and updated that several times. And because of the importance that we believe, again, in sort of where AI is going, and that is going to be pervasive at some point, we know that is going to impact our own business. And so for our CEO and the senior leadership at Avanade, we are spending time, we are doing that education, we are having those conversations, and we are looking at, well, what are those potential impacts going to be for our business? And then starting sort of appropriate work, as you can imagine, around that. And so part of that, as we look at the governance side, if you look at sort of the left side of the slide, there's two ways to think about what's going on, and I've tried to simplify this a bit around generative AI today. There is the customization side. So that is the ability where you are having some use cases that you've identified and that you want to actually potentially build some type of model and use that Azure OpenAI GPT model in some way. Right now, the majority of our clients are looking at things that they are doing from the customization side. So that's really kind of hands-on code doing things in some respects. There's a other angle to this, which is on the consume side. So you can think about this as a software as a service type of model that allows you to be able to utilize software that then has some of that AI or generative AI baked into it. A co-pilot motion is very much a consume type of thing because you are doing an activity in that workflow that you're doing, you're able to tap into those different generative AI user interface elements. It's our belief that while today this is probably about 80-20, again, 80% customize, 20% consume, it's actually going to flip over time. And the majority of us and the majority of the people within our organizations are actually going to be consuming, again, go back to that spell check model. We're going to be consuming it in a way versus doing the customization. So knowing that as the base, that we've got people that are doing learning and experimentation, a lot in the customization side of things, we've started to look at, well, what are the guardrails that we have put in place for our organization? So again, I'm speaking for things that we have done within Avanade. So today you're seeing a little bit of a heat map here of things that we are allowing our employees to be able to do. That is what you're seeing kind of in green and yellow. If I had this chart back in sort of February of this year, this would have been mostly red. So there is work and diligence of things that we have put up from our own governance processes that have got us to a place where we are comfortable. We've given our employees guidance. We know what's happening around the data, and we've been able to then be able to go, well, yes, we are okay with being able to use something like Microsoft GitHub Copilot, which is an intelligent coding application. Now, the way we did that is we understood what was going on, where the data was being used. We assessed those risks. We applied that to the values of kind of Avanade, and we made those decisions. But we also have some checks and balances in place. So for anything where a Avanade engineer today wants to be able to get a license for Microsoft GitHub Copilot, we are enabling that. But at the same time, we created training and are making sure that that employee goes through specific training on intelligent coding. They understand the implications of that, how to identify traditional code versus intelligent code, and in some effect, sort of certifying what they're doing as a part of that, so that they know that there's sort of good use and practice around what we're doing there. And so where we see this going and where we have sort of a lot of our clients sort of really thinking through and trying to figure out today is there's just a lot of attention, a lot of excitement around how do we get started? What are the use cases that we have? Or maybe we even know what the use cases are that we want to have in place. And so there's a lot of direction being driven from the business and the technology side of this. There's then how do I support it from the IT and the operations side? And so what we're seeing as a general blueprint here is, again, very similar to things that we have done ourselves, but sort of standing up across the organization an AI task force, thinking about the notion of an AI center of excellence, and how you begin to not just have these different pockets across the organization that are doing things related to artificial intelligence or generative AI, but that you're elevating all those things up centrally across the organization, because you need to have a different set of a multidisciplinary team. There's things you got to think about related to bias and responsibility. There are components of this where you want to leverage similar models and knowledge that maybe are in one part of the organization but can benefit the other. So that's the notion of kind of bringing all this up and elevating it across an entire organization. The other thing is, what is sort of super important and not to be forgotten, it is so important to have your sort of cloud and your data foundation. So as much as we are excited about the potential of all these things that we can do from AI and generative AI, if your data house is sort of not in order, if you don't have the data governance and the processes that you sort of need around that, or you don't have the data platform pieces in place, it makes it even harder to use some of that internal knowledge and the documents and the data that you have across your organization. You need to have sort of that house in order as a foundation before you can realize some of the true kind of forward value that we're looking at. And so some of the things that we have done around governance, and this is where we're helping clients today, is again, there's things around sort of strategy alignment, corporate fluency. We are seeing organizations begin to put together, well, what are their guiding principles? What does that mean for just their values as an organization? And then reflecting that in guidance for employees. And then when you have these different use cases, how are you running them through, well, what is high risk? What is low risk? What do we know that we are comfortable with and enabling and being and are happy to have that kind of happen within the four walls of the organization, or as a use case that extends beyond the four walls and is maybe with external parties, donors. Maybe that is applications that you're doing for the people that you're actually serving. And then there's sort of the infrastructure, the skilling around sort of employees, and then making sure that you've got an accountability matrix that kind of comes into this. I think this will come into our panel discussion a little bit later today. But there are sort of regulations and other things that we expect to happen, especially like with the EU AI Act. And so you've got to think about, an accountability and line of sight to some of the things that you're doing today. And so if I look across, now this is not necessarily just specific to kind of the nonprofit sector, but these are the four main use cases that we see in general. So there's a lot around knowledge management and search. There is a ton that is happening around sort of document image generation. I think about this as the operations side. So things that you may be thinking about from an automation perspective, and how you're actually then folding in some of the new technology that is coming from things like Azure OpenAI. There is the outreach side, so the sales, marketing, and service. That is around, maybe it's a enhancement to or the creation of a chatbot, but it's also in the outreach, in thinking about sort of different ways that you can do from a marketing, social media, content generation. All of that kind of fits in this sort of sales service, customer service bucket. And then, really looking at sort of the donor and support network and how you begin to actually do potentially different types of reach out and engagement in that space. And so I want to walk through, before we get here to the panel, just 2 or 3 examples to kind of bring this to life a little bit more. So while this is obviously not in the nonprofit sector, you might be able to see some similarities, or I'll ask you to sort of take that sort of leap there. So this was for a client of ours who's an investment bank. And if you think about just trades that are happening, every time a trade happens, an email is generated. And as that email is generated, someone needs to sort of look at that, make sure that it's got all the accurate information in there, and continue it sort of on in the process. So they've got thousands and thousands of emails that are being generated. They had a manual process, is the way that they were sort of currently processing this. The way that we have actually helped them and added in some generative AI technology to this is actually to use the Azure OpenAI service to read those emails as they're coming through, understand the context, categorize them, and then actually do the drafting of the responses. Now, we're not automatically sending those emails, so we still have a human in the loop who is going through, looking at the particular emails, making sure that the information in there is accurate and sending, but it is actually really reducing the overall load and the processing and making them much more productive and efficient. Again, part of this sort of automation plus layer that I was talking about. Something very beginning that we're starting to see, and I suspect we're going to see a whole lot more of this over the next sort of 3 to 6 months, is looking at the software engineering side of things. So this is, I gave our GitHub Copilot sort of example early on, but the ability for someone who needs to, and this doesn't have to be kind of pure code. So I think about in a nonprofit space about, maybe we have reports and we had potentially used Excel macros and other things like that before. How do you quickly write a script, but be able to do that where maybe you are not a person who's ever really coded before? This is really, with generative AI and some of the things within the Azure OpenAI service, that's really moved the starting line on this. So you're able to actually enable people with the ability to do some things around coding that they haven't been able to do before. Again, I share this as sort of an early one because we are running several experiments right now to sort of see if we are getting more productive in this space. But Microsoft has, from the GitHub side, seen some really powerful results, and I just wanted to kind of get this in your mind that this is coming, and it's going to be a pretty powerful area. The other thing is, if no one has seen some of how all of this kind of comes together and works, this is an Avanade example. So this is something where we have taken a very small subset of data that's actually all public from us. So things from our public website, and then some other public sort of content that we have around sort of PowerPoint materials and the like. We quickly put that together in a foundation model, and using Azure OpenAI to create this sort of front-end chatbot where an Avanade seller could then interact with this chatbot to go prep and have a meeting with a particular client. Excuse me. And so what you're seeing here is, I'm trying to get more information. What could I go have this conversation about? And this is something that we've put together in about 2 weeks. So it's very, very sort of, relatively easy to sort of get started. Now, one of the things that I'll call out here that I really like that we started to do is you're starting to see citations. So in this chatbot, as it gets to sort of how we think about, well, is the information accurate? That's why we're kind of adding citations here. So you can actually click through, you can see, what that document that it's actually pulling it from as a part of this. So if you hadn't seen some of this before, again, this is, taking a subset of documents, putting together a front-end chatbot on it in just a very short period of effort to be able to actually bring back some of this knowledge in some of the use cases. The other thing that I'll share, which I think is really important, is we did a piece of work for a sports entertainment company, and they had spent previously a lot of money on translation services. So think about multi-language and kind of multi-country. And one of the things that we have shown to prove successful for them is they do a lot of their videos and that sort of thing created in English. We have taken that and basically used the Azure OpenAI service and some of the transcription services that exist within Azure and been able to actually take what was sort of for one audience content and replicate that much more cheaply and efficiently across several different countries and languages. And so I, again, use that as an example of, you don't have to just kind of take this at face value of its knowledge and documents. You're able to actually look at not just what we have, but being able to create something net new as a part of it, and maybe even look at, new types of services or sort of new value that is there from the cost side of where you might not have seen that before. And I see a quick question on sort of how accurate are the translations. Depending on the language that you're translating to, they're actually pretty good. You do have to do and have as part of your process still a check that's in there to make sure that it's translating things properly. So it's not something that is 100% automated, but translation these days is much, much better than it has ever been, especially as it ties into some of the Azure Cognitive Services. And so I'll just leave us here as we, about to transition into our panel discussion, where we're at from an AI perspective, we've had AI for a very long time. I mean, AI has been here from the 1960s. What we're doing now with generative AI, there's a difference here. You've got to think about this as much more of a living type of system. It is something that we are constantly always going to be working on, learning, becoming more fluent as it becomes more pervasive in the things that we do. And with that, Alman, I will turn it over to you as we get into the panel discussion.